For years, American dominance in global trade had been unquestioned. But this time, Canada didn't just fight back, it outmaneuvered the United States at every turn. The US thought it could pressure Canada into submission, but instead, it triggered an economic firestorm that spiraled out of control. What started as a trade war quickly turned into a full-scale financial crisis, and now, Washington is scrambling to contain the fallout. From devastating tariffs to a nationwide travel boycott, Canada's counterattack hit where it hurt the most. And as US businesses, workers, and politicians began feeling the pressure, something unprecedented happened. Trump's own allies started turning against him. How did Canada pull this off? Why is this trade war shaking the foundations of American power? And could this be the moment that ends US economic supremacy? Stick with us to the end, because what happens next might just rewrite global history. The US thought Canada would fold. That was a massive miscalculation. What happens when a superpower picks a fight it cannot win? The United States thought it could steamroll Canada economically. Instead, it triggered a retaliation that would shake the White House to its core. For decades, the United States and Canada built one of the most intertwined trade relationships in the world. Goods, services, and raw materials flowed between the two nations effortlessly, supporting industries on both sides of the border. The supply chains were seamless, and the economies were deeply connected. But that balance was shattered when the United States government, under President Donald Trump, launched an aggressive economic strike. On February 1, 2025, Washington imposed a sweeping set of tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods. The official reasoning? Border security and drug trafficking. But behind closed doors, it was clear this was never about security. It was about economic control. The United States wanted leverage, a way to pressure Canada into submission. The assumption in Washington was simple: Canada, heavily reliant on American markets, would have no choice but to absorb the impact. After all, this was not the first time the United States had played hardball. Canada had endured trade disputes before, often finding ways to compromise or negotiate. Washington expected history to repeat itself. But this time, it had miscalculated. Because Canada was not just going to retaliate. It was about to flip the script entirely. Canada's $155 billion counterattack, a move Washington never saw coming. If you thought Canada would respond with hesitation, think again. This was not just a pushback, it was an economic missile aimed at America's biggest industries. Within days of the United States tariffs taking effect, Canada unleashed a $155 billion counterstrike. Unlike the broad and sweeping restrictions imposed by Washington, Canada's response was precise, targeted, and devastating. The retaliation came in two phases. The first, worth $30 billion, went into effect immediately, while the remaining $125 billion followed soon after. But here's where Canada's move was different. Instead of just imposing blanket tariffs across multiple industries, it went straight for the sectors that would hurt Trump politically. The strategy was surgical. Industries with the strongest lobbying power in Washington, agriculture, automobiles, and consumer goods, were hit the hardest, and while nearly every major export was included, oil and energy were notably spared. Was this a sign of weakness? Absolutely not. Canada knew that oil and energy were vital to both economies. By keeping those industries untouched, Canada ensured that it still had leverage while focusing its attack elsewhere. Almost immediately, signs of economic distress started surfacing in the United States. Auto manufacturers, who relied on Canadian parts, faced skyrocketing costs and severe supply chain disruptions. American farmers, already struggling with global price pressures, saw one of their biggest export markets suddenly close its doors. And as consumer goods became more expensive, retailers braced for a sharp decline in sales. The economic pain was setting in, and then, Canada launched its most devastating economic attack yet, one that would send shockwaves across America. Canada's secret weapon, the move that shocked the US economy. Tariffs were just the opening move. Canada had something even more powerful up its sleeve. Beyond taxing American goods, Canada urged its citizens to stop vacationing in the United States. At first, it sounded like a simple boycott. But it was not. This was a direct economic strike against one of America's most vulnerable sectors, tourism. Every year, millions of Canadians travel south, spending billions in states like Florida, California, and New York. Canadian visitors are more than just another group of tourists for these regions. They represent a significant economic force, supporting hotels, restaurants, entertainment venues, and entire industries. Now that spending was about to disappear, in a televised address, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau delivered a message that sent shockwaves through the travel and hospitality industries in the United States. Choose Canada, not the United States. With these words, he urged Canadians to reconsider their travel plans and invest their money domestically. The impact was immediate. Airlines and travel agencies reported a surge in cancellations, while resorts and hotels in popular American tourist destinations braced for the consequences. It wasn't only individuals canceling vacations, businesses, conference organizers, and major Canadian corporations redirected their trips elsewhere. Florida, which typically welcomed millions of Canadian visitors annually, saw a sudden decline. California faced a similar fate. Even cities like Las Vegas, where Canadian travelers represented a large share of the gambling industry's revenue, began reporting decreased attendance. As tourism revenue dropped, panic set in among U.S. businesses. The effects weren't limited to tourism. The first American casualties were factories and farmers. When the trade war began, it was expected to harm Canada, but the initial industries to suffer were American ones. The automobile industry, for instance, was hit hard. U.S. car manufacturers had long depended on Canadian-made parts, with production lines seamlessly integrated across the border. But as Canada's tariffs came into play, that system faltered. Supply chains that once operated smoothly were suddenly bogged down with costs, delays, and logistical issues. Major auto factories in Michigan and Ohio struggled immediately, and the cost of producing vehicles increased, forcing manufacturers to cut production and lay off workers. Dealerships braced for higher prices, which could scare away customers. Meanwhile, American farmers were left with unsold crops rotting in storage. Canada had been a key market for U.S. agricultural exports. Grains, dairy, beef, and pork flowed north in large quantities. But with tariffs in place, those products were no longer competitive. Canadian buyers turned to domestic sources or imported from Europe and South America. For many American farmers, this was financially devastating. Without Canadian buyers, many faced the risk of foreclosure, with farms that had been in families for generations on the brink of collapse. Small businesses across the U.S., particularly those that relied on Canadian imports, began to shut down. Retailers faced supply shortages, while manufacturers dealt with rising raw material costs. The ripple effect was undeniable. The trade war had barely begun, but its consequences were already mounting. And this was just the start of the American crisis. A political storm brewed as Republican governors turned against Trump. Initially, they had supported the tariffs, repeating promises that the trade restrictions would protect American jobs and industries. But as the consequences unfolded, the political landscape shifted dramatically. The first signs of rebellion came from the South. The governor of Florida, a longtime Trump supporter, voiced concerns about the toll the trade war was taking on the state's tourism industry. Canadian visitors had been a vital part of Florida's hotels, restaurants, and theme parks for years. With Canada's government urging its citizens to travel elsewhere, the results were devastating. Resort towns that once thrived with vacationers now faced an economic downturn. In a matter of weeks, Florida's tourism industry lost billions, and businesses demanded action. The governor had no choice but to break ranks. In Michigan, the backlash was just as intense, but for different reasons. Auto manufacturers, already grappling with supply chain disruptions, now faced a dramatic drop in sales. Canadian consumers, once loyal customers, were no longer buying. A significant market for American-made cars had turned away from U.S. brands. Factories in Detroit and Grand Rapids were slowing production, cutting shifts, and laying off workers. The governor of Michigan, who had campaigned on bringing jobs back to the state, found himself in an impossible position. He had to choose between continuing to support Trump's tariffs or standing with the thousands of workers at risk of losing their livelihoods. His decision was swift. He called for an immediate reevaluation of the trade war, stating that Michigan could not afford to be collateral damage in Washington's economic battles. Texas, a state that prided itself on economic strength and independence, was also affected. The tariffs on agricultural exports had crippled farmers, and the governor was under immense pressure from the industry. The Texas economy heavily relied on trade with Canada, which was now declining. Grain, beef, and dairy farmers were facing surplus products they could not sell, and food processing plants were reducing operations. The economic pain was real, hitting one of Trump's strongest political bases. The governor of Texas made it clear that while he supported the administration, he could not ignore the devastation the tariffs were causing. He urged Washington to negotiate before more damage was done. The cracks were widening. In Congress, the divide was even more pronounced. Republican lawmakers who had previously supported the trade war were now openly debating whether it was worth the cost. Some pushed for urgent negotiations with Canada, hoping to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled further. Others, still aligned with Trump's strategy, insisted that the tariffs were necessary and that any weakness shown now would embolden America's competitors. The Republican Party was at war with itself, but despite the mounting pressure, Trump refused to back down. His stance remained unwavering. He insisted that the tariffs were a necessary tool to force Canada into a better deal, dismissing the concerns of governors and lawmakers as temporary setbacks. To him, this was not just an economic dispute, it was a battle for control. And Trump had no intention of losing, and that's when his frustration boiled over into a full-blown meltdown. Trump's furious meltdown. Inside the White House crisis, when faced with losing control, Trump did what he did best, he lashed out. Inside the White House, tensions were reaching a breaking point. Leaked reports from senior officials painted a picture of chaos behind closed doors. Trump was furious that his trade war was not going according to plan. What was supposed to be a show of American strength had turned into a crisis that was damaging his reputation. He took to social media with a flurry of posts attacking Canada's Prime Minister, accusing him of acting in bad faith and deliberately harming American industries. His words were not measured. They were not strategic. They were raw, unfiltered anger. He called Canada weak, dishonest, and claimed that without American trade, its economy would collapse, but the response from Canada was measured, calm, and unwavering. The message from the Prime Minister was clear: Canada would not be bullied. Trump's advisors were in full panic mode. The situation was deteriorating fast. With businesses, lawmakers, and governors turning against the tariffs, the White House was losing control of the narrative. Behind closed doors, economic advisors presented grim reports. The stock market was reacting negatively, businesses were holding emergency meetings, and consumer prices were rising. The warnings were clear: if the trade war continued, the fallout would be severe. But Trump was not interested in hearing warnings. He wanted action. He demanded an escalation, insisting that even harsher tariffs be placed on Canadian goods, but this time, his administration pushed back. Senior officials, including members of his economic team, advised against it. They warned that retaliation from Canada would only deepen the crisis. Trump did not want to hear it. He blamed his advisors for failing to control the situation. He blamed Republican lawmakers for being weak. He blamed the media for exaggerating the crisis. He blamed everyone except himself, and then, something happened that nobody saw coming. Trump's biggest backers in business turned against him. The business revolt. U.S. CEOs warn of economic collapse. Big business had supported Trump's policies until they saw the damage.